Good to go. Hey, folks. Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast Livestream. What can I say? Delayed a few minutes. Apologies. But you are here now. A busy day. Hey, if you're in the States like me, tomorrow is Thanksgiving. So it's always nice to kind of ease into the holiday the day before. But this has been a hectic day for me in terms of workload and getting things done. So been very interesting day, but all good and wrapping up now and had to come to you before the holiday with an hour-long live stream like we do every Wednesday. Now be sure to bring your questions. I see some already. We have people from Texas, Kentucky, Colorado, and we'll have people from Africa. We have Australia, Shalom from Australia. Someone just wrote from Norway. We'll have people from Israel, Africa, Europe, South America, and beyond. That's why we love the live streams. Our Watchmen family, the Watchmen and women around the world will be joining us. And again, apologies, I was a few minutes late, but man, oh man, just checking off the work boxes. And we've got some exciting programming coming up. One of the things I was working on today and reviewing is a special program coming up on TBN on November 29th. The history of Hanukkah, a TBN Hanukkah special. Now, you might say, Stakelbeck, you're a Christian, you're a follower of Jesus. Why on earth do you care about Hanukkah? Well, that's what we're going to unpack on this special airing 8 p.m. this Eastern time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, this Monday, November 29th on TBN. I care about Hanukkah for a number of reasons. Number one, Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. That's right. The Gospel of John says Jesus went up to Jerusalem to celebrate, to observe the Feast of Dedication. That is another name for Hanukkah. So it was important enough for Jesus to go up to Jerusalem and celebrate the holiday. That's number one. So that's a big deal for me. And number two, the story of the Maccabees. Do you know the story of Judah the Hammer and this heroic Israeli family that about 160, 168 years before Jesus, the Maccabean revolt broke out against the Greek Seleucid Empire. And folks, what a story that I think can really resonate with us today. The struggle for religious freedom that the Maccabees engaged in was absolutely inspiring and tremendous. There's a reason that the Maccabees helped inspire America's founding fathers. There's even a statue of Judah Maccabee at West Point here in the United States. So amazing story. I'll be honest with you, growing up, not being Jewish and being a Christian growing up, I had a lot of Jewish friends. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I would say, man, I would joke with them and say, man, I feel bad for you. This is when I was a teenager, a young kid. I feel so bad for you guys. You don't have Christmas. You have the 8 days, but Christmas is so much better. But one of our guests during the special for TBN said, hey, without Hanukkah, there would be no Christmas. Why does he say that? You have to check it out. Tune into the special. You will learn a lot. I certainly have over the years about Hanukkah and its importance. Things, again, I knew nothing about when I was a young guy, but then when I started following Jesus and got serious about my faith, I've learned a lot. Let's just say that. And this special, I think you'll really like it. Dennis Prager, Jonathan Bernis. We have some on-the-ground reports from Israel, from the birthplace of the Maccabees, and much more. So check that out on Monday, November 29th. That's one of the things we've been working on today. But hey, we want to get into today a few very important topics. And we have people writing in right now. This is great, from all over the place, from all over the world. We've got thousands of people with us already right now. So this is a good way to get into our holiday. And it won't be all doom and gloom. We've got a lot to be thankful for. And I want to ask you here as we get started, what are you thankful for right now? Even if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, if you're in another country, here in the U.S., we do, of course. What are you thankful for in your life? Leave some comments here. That would be kind of cool and encouraging, I think, here. And I've got a lot I'm thankful for, and I might share a little testimony nugget or two before we finish today. We are going for an hour. Again, leave your questions here. We will have Q&A as always at the end. We want to get into today Iran in South America. Now, we talk so much about the Iranian regime's nefarious activity here in the Middle East, of course. But what about what Iran is doing in the Western Hemisphere? My neck of the woods. Hey, I'm in the United States, And Iran is trying, according to Israel's defense minister, Benny Gantz, a very important speech he gave yesterday. Iran is trying to increase its presence in South America. We'll get into that. We also want to talk about some airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes, once again in Syria last night, overnight, late night. And today, have you heard that Australia has banned Hezbollah outright? Now, we talked about last week on the newscast how Great Britain has banned Hamas. That announcement was made on Friday, November 19th. And there's this game that's been played, folks, over the years where Europe and the UN, these entities, these global bodies have said, okay, and some European nations, not just global bodies, have said, well, Hezbollah and Hamas have a military wing, but they also have a political wing, and we have to have a distinction between the military wing and the political wing. Look, the political wing is involved in diplomacy. You'll see Hamas and Hezbollah leaders, representatives, perhaps travel to foreign countries and meet with world leaders. So we're going to hold them separate from the jihadi military wing, which is murdering and maiming and blowing people up. That has been the unfortunate distinction that much of Europe has drawn over the years. There are signs that distinction, thankfully, better late than never, is starting to come to an end. I said on the newscast the other day, terrorists are terrorists, no matter whether they're wearing a suit and tie or whether they're wearing camo and fatigues. Terror is terror, and the ideological driving forces behind much of the physical terror that you see are the so-called political leaders of these organizations. These are the people who are giving the ideological motivation for the jihad and for the terror. So they are every bit as guilty, have every bit as much blood on their hands as the person carrying out the actual physical terrorism. So there should be no distinction made. Thankfully, Australia did this today. We'll talk more about that as well. And an interesting agreement today reached between Israel and Morocco. Did you see this, folks? The first of its kind, the first ever Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU for short, signed by Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz. He's in the Moroccan capital of Rabat today with his Moroccan counterpart signing this deal. Now, last year, of course, Morocco signed on to the Abraham Accords, and now the relationship is deepening. We've outlined here on the newscast how Israel's relationship with the UAE and Bahrain has also deepened, and now Morocco, this historic defense pact. Very interesting times we are living in, folks, to say the least. Yes, the enemies are on the march. Israel's adversaries, the adversaries of America, the West, freedom, all free nations are on the march in the form of Iran and that Iranian axis. And by the way, the enemies of the Sunni Arab world as well, represented by Iran and its terror axis. Yes, they are on the march, but on the other hand, we have this promising relationship developing between Israel and its Sunni Arab neighbors. So I've said before here that we're at a point in history where the sheep nations and the goat nations are being separated in a sense. On one side, you have Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Morocco, of course, Jordan, Egypt. And then on the other side, you have Iran, of course, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza alongside Hamas, the various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, the Assad regime in Syria as well, although there are some signs there that he may, I wouldn't bet the house on this to say the least, but there are some indicators that Assad is trying to reach out to the nations of the region and have some kind of normal relationship with them once again. But he has been firmly in the Iranian axis for some time. Essentially, Syria under Assad has become an Iranian client state because Iran, with help from Russia, helped bail Assad out when his back was against the wall and helped him to prevail in that bloody Syrian civil war. So that's the axis. And then we have Turkey, of course, and we will talk about them a bit today as well. From time to time, collaborating with that axis and other times working independently. towards its own radical aims under its president Erdogan. So that's the divide in the region right now, folks. That's how it is breaking down, and that is how it is broken up, essentially. So we'll talk about that as well. Hey, before I get into it, I mentioned the Hanukkah special real quick. I think you'll like this for Thanksgiving. And with obviously the holiday shopping season upon us, and a lot of people will be shopping over the next few days, and Christmas is upon us. A great company that we are partnering with here at the Watchman Newscast. And don't worry, we got plenty of time. We got the whole hour for news and questions. Give me 1 minute here, 1 minute, because this could bless you and your families. Listen up. I want to introduce you to a great company that we're partnering here with now on the Watchman Newscast called Canopy. Now, if you know what we do here, we don't partner with many organizations. Artsa is one, the great Artsa boxes, Meir Panim, and that's about it. I only partner with organizations that we believe in, who are legit and who are doing great work. And Canopy is certainly one of them. It is a cutting edge internet filter made and developed in Israel. Now, who out there is a mom or a dad or a grandfather or a grandmother? Hey, as you know, if you watch on a regular basis, I'm the father of 2 girls, a teenager and a preteen. So needless to say, what is on the internet is of great concern to me, and what they are consuming online and what they are looking at. That's where Canopy comes in. We can't be in 50 places at once, right? We all have busy lives, and sometimes the kids kind of disappear and they hop on their device. Canopy is an internet filter that blocks not only explicit material like porn, but is the only tool that I'm aware of that can prevent sexting, a big problem among kids today, right? So from the internet porn to sexting, explicit content, skin, all that stuff, Canopy will block it. And folks, it's a great deal. Look, not only is this innovation technology made in Israel, but I have the numbers right here. The Watchman discount right now, go to canopy.us/Watchman. We've got a Watchman landing page there with this exclusive offer from Canopy for your family. 15% off. I want to get the facts here correct. Use the discount code Watchman15 and you'll get 15% off, a free 30-day trial of Canopy, and 15% off your lifetime subscription. Guess what? It's $8 a month, folks. $8 a month to block this explicit content on all of the devices in your home, your phone, your tablets. Canopy will do the job. It will block it for $8 a month. Again, of course, Israeli innovation. So you're blessing the Israeli economy. In a sense, it's Israeli innovation made in Israel, and you're blessing your family. Hey, your kids are worth it. $8 a month. Check it out. Canopy.us/Watchman. Discount code Watchman15. It's a good offer. Check it out. I believe in this product. Good people for sure. I've met them personally. Okay, let's get into the news in depth. South America, we've got people from all over the place writing in right now. This is great. South America. Let's talk about the Western Hemisphere. We talk so much about what's happening in the Middle East, of course, and North Africa and Asia. What about our hemisphere? I say our as an American. There was something not that long ago called the Monroe Doctrine, where, look, if an enemy was operating in our hemisphere and hostile activity in the Western Hemisphere, then the United States would act. Well, Benny Gantz, and we've talked about this long before Benny Gantz's speech yesterday, but he gave an invaluable speech yesterday, folks, in my estimation, in Herzliya, Israel, at a counterterrorism conference. He said a few things. South America was one. Let me break that down in a second. But also, if you missed yesterday's newscast, check it out here in our archives. He talked about, or he exposed 2 Iranian drone bases where they are launching these attack drones, and they are using them to, not only they're supplying them to their proxies across the region, but they are using these drones, the Iranian regime, to attack Israeli shipping, Israeli-owned or controlled shipping in the waters of the region. So Gantz exposed those bases, but he talked about Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps trying to establish a greater foothold in South America. Now, I think of a few places there. We've talked about the tri-border region. I wish I had a map here right now. It's the place in South America where Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina meet, the tri-border region. Folks, this is essentially a lawless zone, kind of like a Wild West type area there in South America, where there is drug smuggling, all sorts of nefarious activities. Hezbollah has a major presence there. They have for years. And what they will do is Hezbollah will engage in this illicit activity, smuggling drugs, humans, all sorts of illicit materials. They'll take the profits, the money from the profits, smuggling drugs, etc., and Hezbollah will then send it back home to their home base in southern Lebanon. And that drug money will help fuel terrorism against Israel and other nations and individuals in the region and beyond. That's how it works. Hezbollah's had a pretty effective pipeline running from South America back to the Middle East for years now. And the main node of that would be that tri-border region. So that's one piece to this puzzle. Remember also in the early 90s, 1992, 1994, Hezbollah, on the orders of the Iranian regime, attacked the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, also a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So there is a bloody and deadly track record here. Dozens and dozens of people were killed in those two attacks, again, on the orders of the Iranian regime. So no great surprise that Iran would want to further its influence here in the Western Hemisphere one way. According to Benny Gantz, they're doing it. And again, he specifically mentioned Iran's elite Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Remember Qasem Soleimani, the terror mastermind? He was an IRGC guy, a heavyweight in this elite organization, which answers directly to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. One way they want to do it, further their influence, is through their relationship with Venezuela. Surprise, surprise. Now take it back to the previous decade and even further back. Hugo Chavez, the not so dearly departed socialist dictator in Venezuela, he passed on, but now Nicolas Maduro is the leader of Venezuela. Chavez was very cozy with the Iranian regime, and now Maduro has arguably furthered those ties. And what Iran is doing, according to Benny Gantz, is trying to ship weapons to Venezuela, again, here in the Western Hemisphere. So trying to build up Venezuela's arsenal. Remember, Maduro has made noise over the years about being targeted by the U.S. He's been, a lot of times, folks, tyrants and dictators are fearful and paranoid. And Maduro has been very paranoid over the years, in recent years especially, talking about a potential U.S. coup against him and the United States overthrowing him in Venezuela. So no surprise, he wants to bolster his military and defense capabilities, and Iran is all too eager to help him do that. Not only that, why else would Iran want to be in the Western Hemisphere? Hey, clearly there is a very open southern border of the United States right now along the U.S. border with Mexico, and God forbid, could Iran or Hezbollah want to transit operatives through that porous border? Folks, it's there, it's open. It doesn't seem like a heavy lift to ship operatives over the border. Again, God forbid. We know we've had people from the Middle East, many over the years, apprehended at the border. So that is a plausible scenario. It's not alarmism. It's a plausible scenario if Iran and Hezbollah have a presence in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, essentially at America's doorstep. Is it beyond reality that they would one day perhaps try to enter through America's southern border? And perhaps they have already. And in the event of future hostilities with Iran and Hezbollah, not only U.S. hostilities, but if Israel goes toe-to-toe with them in the Middle East, do they try to respond on American soil as well? So something we're keeping a close eye on here. I'd like to dig into this deeper, perhaps on the Watchman TV show, in addition to the newscast, of course, but we can go really in depth there and interview some experts and some folks who are really up on this Iran in Latin America issue. It's a serious one. And I'm glad Gantz brought that up yesterday. And his reasoning for bringing it up was to show people that, look, this is a global threat. Iran, Hezbollah, that whole axis It's not just a threat that people in the Middle East have to worry about. It's not just Israel's problem. It's not just Saudi Arabia's problem. It's a world problem. And Iran and its proxies now have global reach. Look no further than Australia, down under, where they've had their own issues in recent months with lockdowns and all the rest. Yet today, Australia, in my view, made a very good move by announcing they have banned Hezbollah outright, political and military. We talked about this in the beginning of the live stream. If you missed it, this will be posted today, Wednesday, November 24th, on our YouTube channel. Hey, while you're there, you've probably subscribed if you're with us right now, right? On the live stream. This is the nitty gritty, the watchmen and women joining on the live stream. But if you haven't for some reason, hey, be sure to subscribe while you're there so you get alerts every time a video is posted. Click the notification bell, all that good stuff. But Monday through Friday, every day, except tomorrow, Thanksgiving. But Friday, we will be back. Never fear. But Australia making this move today, fascinating to me and to most people. I knew about there is a pretty strong Lebanese population in Australia. Obviously, not all Lebanese people support Hezbollah, but look, just like in South America, there's a Lebanese population there. Some do support Hezbollah back home in the mother country of Lebanon. Same deal in Australia among the population there. Some, not all, but Australia saw this as serious enough of a threat to outright ban the Hezbollah movement today on Australian soil. Some people were commenting last Friday when I talked about the UK banning Hamas outright and saying, what do you mean ban? It's not like Hamas is running around blowing people up in the UK. It's not like Hezbollah is doing the same in Australia. No, I understand that. But this goes beyond just physical terror. This goes to people supporting, overtly and openly supporting, marching in favor of these deadly terror movements, Hamas and Hezbollah, sending money to these movements, providing the ideological support for these movements, defending them in the public arena, and espousing their viewpoints, which are genocidal viewpoints. So Australia with Hezbollah and Great Britain last week with Hamas says enough is enough. And like me, you're probably watching this and saying, hey, this is the English-speaking world as well. You know, I mean, for an American, it's our cousins in the case of the UK across the pond against, in the case of Australia, way across the pond. But what took them so long? Here in the US, obviously, these movements, these terror movements have been banned outright for years. Hamas and Hezbollah at the forefront, of course. So what takes Europe so long and the rest of the quote unquote Western world? Good question. We live in times of moral relativism, folks. Sadly, talking about the UK last week, a guy I've admired greatly in my life has been Winston Churchill. I said, man, oh man, could the UK use a man like him today? Moral clarity. It's severely lacking in the Western world, in the bastion, formerly at least, of Judeo-Christian values and a biblical worldview and a biblical approach that's going by the wayside more and more as Europe is way down the secularized road, and the US is leaning in that direction as well. But thankfully, here in the US, and I know in Europe as well, we do have a believing remnant who's saying, not so fast. I think of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, when Elijah was so despondent after his showdown with the prophets of Baal. He was victorious, and yet Jezebel threatened his life, basically put a death sentence on his head. He fled. He was in a cave, and he was saying, God, why? Why is this happening? He felt like he was all alone on an island. I'm the only one standing against madness and godlessness around the world. And God said, Elijah, not so fast. I still have 7,000 men that I've set aside, that I've reserved for myself, who have not bent their knee to Baal. So I don't know where you are right now in the world and how discouraged you are, but you are not alone. Hey, you're with thousands of us right here on the Watchman Newscast live stream right now, but I can assure you, because, hey, a lot of times I feel that way too. We feel like voices crying out in the wilderness all alone, but God has reserved others. There is a believing remnant in the world right now. It is strong here in the U.S., and it is strong in other areas of the world as well. So never, ever feel like you are utterly alone, folks, because that is not the case. And if you ever do feel alone, just join us here on a Watchman Newscast live stream. We're with you and we love you. Okay. We got into the Hezbollah issue. We got into South America. We want to get into Syria real quick. Before I do, just a quick hello to everyone. Let's check out what we have here. People from all over the world, as always. I love this, the day before Thanksgiving, people writing in. Let's look at questions. We're getting into questions. Wow, probably in about 15 minutes, we'll get into questions. Hey, what are you thankful for too? I'm just interested what you're thankful for. We might not even talk about that too much, but a little bit I want to. But Thanksgiving here in the States, and not think outside the box a little bit. Of course, we're thankful for the Lord, for Jesus, the penalty he paid for us. Thankful for our families, and in the U.S. to live in a still a free country. We've got a lot of issues right now, and people trying to encroach on that freedom, but still, by and large, a free country. So much to be thankful for. But what about being thankful? Here's an outside the box perspective. And I thought about this a lot today. Do you remember when King David said in the Psalms, "It's good that I was afflicted"? Yes, we all know King David, one of the great biblical heroes I love. I'm sure everyone watching loves King David and his story. But he was afflicted, certainly, and suffered great hardship, trials, and tribulation. Yet he was thankful for that. Why? In our society today, the attitude is, why me? Why is this happening? Nothing good can come out of this. But in the case of King David, and of course, Joseph, God can take what the enemy meant for evil and use it for good. I want to share a story about that in a minute before we get into Q&A. But real quick, let's talk about Syria. There were some airstrikes, probably Israeli airstrikes last night around the Syrian city of Homs. Some 6 Syrian soldiers wounded, reportedly, according to Syrian media sources. And hey, we talked about this on the newscast last week, folks, but things are really ramping up in Syria. I mean, the interesting thing about it, as I look down here at my phone, pardon me, just looking at some questions that people are sending along. The interesting thing, one of the many interesting things about it, is we had kind of thought here, prior to that meeting between Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, and Vladimir Putin in Sochi in Russia last month, we had thought, man, okay, is Israel going to have to scale back these attacks against Iran and Hezbollah and their various radical allies inside Syria so as to not anger Vladimir Putin? Well, in a sense, the opposite has happened over the past month, in that Israel seems to, if anything, have ramped up their strikes against Iran and its allies inside Syria after that Putin meeting. They believe, Israeli leaders and Israeli officials, that Putin basically gave them the green light to continue to act against Iran. And Putin's one request reportedly was, hey, look, you're making us look bad, basically, because Israel was evading these Russian-supplied missile defense systems or air defense systems that Russia supplied to the military of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator. And Israeli fighter jets were consistently evading those systems and hitting Iran, Hezbollah, and the rest of those radical actors inside Syria hard and very effectively in pushing them back. So that kind of was a bit, I should say, embarrassing for Russia. Similar issues with the Soviet Union during the Yom Kippur War and the War of Attrition back in the early 70s, with Israel getting the better of Soviet technology as it took on Egypt. So kind of deja vu here, I guess you would say. It's happening again, and Israel evading those advanced Russian systems to get the job done against Iran and push Iran back. But how long does this relationship last? We know that Vladimir Putin had a great relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu traveled to Russia more than any other country to kind of smooth things over with Vladimir Putin. 2 reasons: Iran and Syria. Russia, again, folks, don't forget, has been in Syria now for over 6 years. Russian forces entered Syria in September 2015, and they are there to stay. They're not going anywhere. And if Iran has its way, Iranian forces aren't going anywhere either. But Israel has something to say about that. And it is a collision course right now in Syria, with Israel squaring off with Iran and its allies there. But Russia is the elephant, or should I say the bear, in the room. And we put this out there on the newscast last week. Number one, okay, Bennett, Putin, a great first meeting, according to all accounts in Israel, excuse me, had a great first meeting. But how long does that last? And how long before Vladimir Putin says enough is enough? Because, again, it's his allies taking lumps in Syria, courtesy of Israel. Hey, Russia has been closely aligned with Iran and Hezbollah, shoulder to shoulder with them on the battlefields of Syria. Russian forces are in Syria, observing these Israeli strikes firsthand. Putin is a very prideful guy. Right now, he's playing both sides. He's trying to maintain a relationship with Israel, but also maintain a relationship with Iran and Assad. But folks, I believe if the rubber ever hits the road, that he would side with, sadly, the Iran-Assad axis. Those ties to Syria go deep even before Bashar al-Assad, to the days of his father, Hafez, and the Soviet Union. Syria was a client state of the Soviets then. Russia's got major business interest with Iran, helping Iran to build nuclear reactors. And at the end of the day, Russia likely sees Israel as part of the West, ultimately as aligned with the US and Europe, although Europe is a fair weather friend with Israel by and large, as we know all too well. But Russia sees Israel, I believe, more in the Western orbit, even though it is located in the Middle East. It's an outpost of freedom and democracy in the heart of the Middle East. So when the rubber hits the road, and we've talked about this many times on the live stream, perhaps it will hit the road with the war of Gog and Magog, which is laid out in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. Many believe that Russia will be a part of that last days confederacy that comes against Israel. I say last days because the book of Ezekiel says last days. It specifically says this will happen in the latter days, Latter, with a confederacy of nations coming against Israel. It doesn't end too well for those nations, by the way. If you don't believe me, just read Ezekiel 38 and 39, how it all plays out. But many believe Russia will be at the head of that confederacy, along with Iran. Persia is specifically and explicitly named as part of this confederation. Iran today was called Persia back then when the book of Ezekiel was written. Others believe Turkey will be involved, and Libya and other nations. So will Russia be? It seems that the consensus here on the Watchman News channel has been that Russia will be a part of that confederacy. But I have to say, folks, look, I have a lot of people who write in and say, hey, Russia will not be a part of that Gog and Magog war. Many people believe Turkey will be the lead player in that, along with Iran, and that Russia will have nothing to do with it. Many people have even written that Vladimir Putin is defending Christian civilization. I have to beg to differ on that. To my knowledge, Vladimir Putin is not a practicing Christian. I don't want to speak for him, but I think many times you can tell where someone is in their faith simply by their fruits. Jesus said, by their fruits you will know them. I don't know that Vladimir Putin has the greatest fruits when it comes to a Christian walk, but those are some of the varying opinions out there that I hear here in our comments. So I'm just sharing it with you. Russia or not Russia. Some people seem to say, hey, leave Putin alone. He's not doing anything wrong. Others have even defended the Assad regime, and they've tried to say that Assad is defending Christians. They've made the point that Assad is better for Syria's Christians than ISIS. Ultimately, if Assad answers to Iran, the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, but the regime, the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, and ISIS, essentially two sides of the same coin, different theology, one side Shia, one Sunni, different tactics. Iran and Hezbollah more patient, playing the long game. But at the end of the day, in many ways, the same end game and goals as the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Hey, they've fought each other. They've also collaborated, Al-Qaeda with Iran in certain instances, undoubtedly. The enemy of my enemy is my friend when it comes to these terror groups. And they can put the Sunni Shia divide aside to cooperate against the likes of Israel and the United States. So some interesting takes there I wanted to share with you, because a lot of people comment about this on the newscast. There are some variant takes, and hey, that's what makes this newscast great, and it makes the country I live great historically, that you can have an opinion without being canceled and shut down. That seems to be changing in large part, but we hope we can preserve that as much as possible. One last thing I wanted to mention, this defense agreement between Israel and Morocco. Wow, very interesting. One of its kind, signed today, a big news day. A memorandum of understanding that will deepen military cooperation between Israel and Morocco. I've got a story for you, a personal story on that very topic, real quick, before we get into the questions. I met, probably about a decade ago. I was based in Washington, D.C. I was working for CBN News at the time. A good friend of mine, he became a pretty good friend, not buddy, but he was a good guy, good friend. We had lunch and just, it was a business relationship, but he was a good contact for great information from the region. He was a defense official for Morocco, and he was here in DC frequently. And we met one day for lunch. He was going to brief me so I could report on this subject for CBN. Now it's TBN. Back then I worked for CBN. He was going to brief me on Al-Qaeda activity in North Africa in the Sahara region. Folks, I have to tell you, we spent practically the entire conversation talking not about Al-Qaeda, but the threat posed by Iran and Hezbollah. Now, this was probably, 9-10 years ago. It was around the time my first book came out in 2011. So about 10 years ago. And even then, Morocco was gravely concerned about Iran and Hezbollah. Fast forward 10 years, even more so clearly, the Iran threat, the Iranian axis that we laid out earlier in this live stream, that is arguably the main driving force behind the Abraham Accords and behind these Sunni Arab nations looking at Israel and saying, hey, Israel's looking pretty good right now. Let's join up. Let's align ourselves with Israel, the strong horse in the region. And we know that Israel will do what it has to do to push back against Iran and Hezbollah. So if you're wondering why the Abraham Accords are taking place in Morocco, UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, and all these nations are coming closer to Israel, there's a lot of reasons. Israeli technology, innovation, etc., without a doubt, can bless the entire region. But that Iran threat and essentially survival is probably the main driving force, the shared threats posed by that Iranian axis in the region, and the concern that the United States and certainly Europe will not stand with these nations. Do the Saudis right now under Joe Biden and the UAE, Morocco, etc., can they look west and say, well, if Iran acts up, so to speak, we can rely on the US and NATO to have our backs? Can they really say that right now? After what just went down in Afghanistan in August, can any American ally, and as a proud patriotic American, it grieves me to say this, can any American ally right now look at America, look at the West and say, America has our back. The chips may get down, things might get kind of hairy, but we always know at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, America will be by our side. Can America's allies really say that right now? What do you think they're thinking right now in places, not only Israel and the Sunni Arab nations, but what about places like Taiwan and Ukraine? Look, China and Russia are making open threats against Taiwan, Ukraine. What about South Korea and nations like that? So we live when a nation that has acted as the leader of the free world, by and large, since World War II, we've had Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, now Joe Biden, where it has been clearly down periods where we have not acted as a force for moral clarity, that shining city on a hill in the world. And when that happens, it's not good for the world because there is disorder and things tend to fall apart. And we are seeing that certainly right now, not only internally to a degree here in the US, but certainly in the foreign policy realm. The world's worst actors are certainly on the move. One of our commenters just wrote in about China testing these high-tech weapons, hypersonic missiles and all the rest, which can be nuclear armed, and China building nuclear silos at a rapid pace. Hey, let's get into questions. We have about 15 minutes left, I believe. Some folks are asking me what I'm doing for Thanksgiving. Laying low. I will say I have a trip coming up and you're going to like it. I'll say that. I don't want to say too much, but a trip is coming up very, very soon that I'm kind of preparing for. So Thanksgiving, I'll be with my family, my wife and my daughters, my brother and my sister will stop over, and some cousins, my wife's cousins will see as well. So kind of low key, we're doing it at home and pretty low key. My mom passed away in February 2020, right before, ironically enough, the COVID madness really started in March 2020. So my mom passed in February 2020. My dad passed back in 2003. And my wife's parents passed as well in 2008, back to back, a month apart. That's a whole other story. But thank God, we know they're looking down at us, and we know that we have brothers, sisters, cousins, our kids, some dear friends too. So we'll be laying low. We've got some good food lined up, so it's going to be good. And I hope everyone else has some good plans for their Thanksgiving as well. And even if you're not in the United States, why not? Why not use this day just to be thankful? You don't have to have a big old turkey and stuffing and have a big, massive dinner with your family, but you can at least take this day. And God bless our founders for setting aside a day for Thanksgiving, to give thanks to God. I think that gets lost sometimes, just like the message of Christmas, the consumerism. And tomorrow's not just a day to have off and get stuffed and eat a lot of food. This is a day explicitly to give thanks to God Almighty. So I will be doing that in prayer for certain. And no matter where you live around the world, I think it's a good opportunity. Never a bad thing to glorify God and thank him for what he's done in your life. Keep the questions coming. Real quick, we talk about being afflicted and what we can learn from that. Now we can actually be thankful for being afflicted. No one likes trials, tribulations, and afflictions, certainly. But I can think of one. There was a job I was entering a few years back, and a guy was a friend of mine, a pretty good friend of mine. And once I was going to work at this organization, this is years back, will not be named. Once I was going to work at this organization, he changed his tune, and he seemed to be threatened by my potential presence at this organization. We were friends, and all of a sudden it got really weird. And he was putting up roadblock after roadblock. And folks, this lasted for 5 or 6 months, where I felt like God was leading me to this place, but I didn't see a way forward with this guy kind of there, kind of blocking my path, I guess you would say. And it was very discouraging. And I was crying out, God, what is going on here? I feel like you want me here, but then this guy's throwing up every possible roadblock. Thankfully, God put a guy by my side, a dear brother in Christ, who walked me through. There were times I was going to walk away and say, I'm done. This guy said, stick with it. He said, there are giants in the land. Hey, when the Israelites spied out the promised land, there were giants in the land. Are you a Joshua? Are you a Caleb? Or are you the other guys? So I said, okay, I resolved to be a Joshua or a Caleb and stick with it. And I stuck with it, and God worked it all out beautifully in the end. And that guy who was kind of that blocking force ended up moving on, and kind of moved on, not in the best fashion, sadly for him. And I forgive him. I have nothing against the guy, never did. But it was really a trial and a stressful time. But God, once the breakthrough came, it broke through in an amazing way. So I just say that to encourage you. And my bottom line is, I'm thankful that it happened. King David said, I'm thankful for my affliction. I'm thankful that you afflicted me. It helped lead me in the right direction. I have to tell you, folks, that built my faith. That experience, 5 or 6 month trial, really built my faith. And it showed me wow, God will never leave you or forsake you. But it also showed me we can trust him. He will make your paths straight. Proverbs, right? I was praying, hey, God, in all my ways, I will acknowledge you and you will make my paths straight. And I trusted in him with all my heart, like the word of God tells us to do. And he did indeed make my path straight. I didn't lean on my own understanding, although I was tempted to for much of that time. Again, God put that brother in Christ by my side who helped walk me through it, a mature brother in Christ. And he worked all things together for my good because I love him and I knew I was called according to his purpose. So if you are going through a trial right now, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and God can take evil and what adversaries mean for evil and turn it for your good. And you will learn. Every trial I've had, folks, I think a lot of people out there can relate. I have learned so much more from the trials in my life and the challenges and the failures than I have from the successes. So keep that in mind. No matter what you're going through right now, God can use this affliction and use it for good. And when it's all done, and it will end, you will learn a lot from this. It will build your trust in God and it will just open new doors for you. I truly believe that. I can speak from many situations like that in my life. I've shared some of them on previous newscasts, but stick with it. Don't get discouraged. And when I do get down, I try to focus on the positive, like tomorrow, a day of Thanksgiving. Okay, this is going on and it ain't good, but what can I be thankful for? Look at all the good that's going on. I used to work with a guy at CBN back in the day who would say, Stacks, that's my nickname, Stakelbeck, you're too blessed to be stressed. And the way he would say it, I would always laugh. He's a great guy, but he was so encouraging. And that is true. So I hope that gave you a little food, no pun intended on Thanksgiving, food for thought. Some questions. Let's see here. Got a few coming in. Bear with me as I look down for just a moment and pull up these questions. Let's see. What do you think happens with Iran and Syria if Russia strikes Ukraine? Interesting question. If Russia strikes Ukraine, I don't know that Iran and Syria do much. I think they kind of sit back and watch it unfold. But I do believe if Russia does strike Ukraine, I mean, God forbid, we don't want to see that. If they do, it does show you that Russia is emboldened. And I think with the questioner, Bill Eady, thanks, Bill, for the question. I think what Bill might be getting at is not what Iran and Syria do. Do they act along with Russia? But what are the ramifications? Okay, if if Russia hits Ukraine or invades Ukraine, starts a war with Ukraine, what does that mean for the Middle East? Does that mean that Russia is now going to throw its weight around everywhere? Hey, if they'll act in Ukraine, maybe all of a sudden they'll really start flexing their muscles. And again, the Russian military is in Syria as we speak, not far from the mountains of Israel. Does Russia really start flexing its muscle around the world, including in Syria and the Middle East? What would that then mean for Israel and for the West? So I think that's a good question. I don't think Iran and Syria do anything, but if there are benefits in Russia's view and the view of its allies to an invasion of Ukraine, perhaps that would be it. The strong horse, right? Iran and Syria could say, look at our ally, Russia, acting with strength, and we have a strong ally in Russia. We can rely on Russia. Can they? We may soon see down the line for sure. Someone asks, Diana Smith asks, do you believe that the Biden-led America will be there to support and back up Israel? Diana, I'm sad to say, no, I don't in the long term for sure, or really in the short term for that matter. It depends what kind of support you're talking about. If there is an invasion of Israel, like is described in Ezekiel 38 and 39 during the Biden term, I find it unlikely that America under Biden would come rushing to Israel's aid militarily. I'm sad to say that, but I don't think we had that question under the Trump administration. But I think it's an open question now. So in a military sense, will America still provide Israel with funding, and advanced weapon systems? Yes. But will America, if a major regional war breaks out, would America have boots on the ground or something to that effect? I find it unlikely. Hey, a lot of people watching might say, good. I get a lot of commenters who say, we shouldn't have American boots on the ground there. In the first place, we should completely be done with the Middle East. Some say that. But if there is a full-scale onslaught against Israel, you would think that the United States would step up and stand with its ally, like say Richard Nixon did during the Yom Kippur War, airlifting weaponry, replenishing Israel's weapon stockpiles, helping it to prevail in that war. Would the Biden administration do the same? Folks, look, there are left-wing ideologues littered throughout that administration, and is Joe Biden cognitively on the ball enough? And Kamala Harris, where does she stand on Israel? You get some not so friendly vibes, perhaps, from her when it comes to Israel. I know she's married to a Jewish guy, but I haven't heard her say too much about Israel. But the left wing bent that she has, usually today's modern left wing, is not very friendly to Israel. I think that's pretty undeniable. If you're looking at the hard left, the Squad and AOC and these are people who are openly anti-Israel. I'm not saying Kamala Harris is openly anti-Israel. What I'm saying is not quite where she falls with Israel. And who knows if Biden's going to run for a second term, and he's saying this week that he is. Interesting times here in the United States where I'm coming to you from, but I don't believe you can rely on this administration ultimately. When things, I keep using this term today, when the rubber really hits the road, I don't know that Israel can rely on this administration. I certainly didn't feel that way about the Obama administration. And this is essentially a third Obama term, but worse in my view under the Biden administration. And remember, the parting shot out the door at the UN in December 2016, where the Obama administration did not support Israel at the General Assembly, which sent shockwaves throughout the world and throughout the U.S.-Israel relationship. So militarily, no, you're not going to see America jump up and stand by Israel. It will supply Israel with some weaponry, for sure. But diplomatically may be the larger question. Hey, folks, the honeymoon's over between the new Israeli government and the Biden administration. There are some serious issues. There are some conflicts. I'm not saying physical conflict, but certainly diplomatic and governmental conflicts brewing over the Iran nuclear deal, over quote unquote Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland, which the world knows as the West Bank. We prefer to call it the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria here on the newscast, but those are two potential diplomatic brawls that are brewing, and things got very acrimonious under the Obama administration. And there are many Obama holdovers in the Biden administration. Could it go there once again when the disagreements start? The honeymoon is over. Bennett and Biden had a very cordial meeting in late August at the White House, but the Iran nuclear talks are scheduled to start back up again on Monday, November 29th. Will they happen? Will they actually happen? Will Iranian representatives show up in Vienna? Good question. But nonetheless, they are scheduled to start back up again. And that Iran nuclear deal, folks, as we move into 2022, that will be a pressing issue that will weigh on the world more and more. And what will Israel do, whether Iran is able to re-enter this disastrous deal or says we're not going to re-enter it? What does Israel do? That question may be answered in 2022. We may have an answer as to whether this deal will be revived over the next year. So there's a lot going on in the world, but that Iran nuclear deal, some have described it, the Iran nuclear crisis, as like the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. That's a pretty good description. Look, the Iran crisis has lasted now for, over 20 years, at least, the Iran nuclear crisis. So keep an eye on what happens November 29th in Vienna and beyond. We'll be talking about a lot. Time for one more question, then we got to roll. Let's see here. Good question here. How about Iranian proxies in Venezuela plotting against Israeli interests? We talked about South. This is probably a good way to close because we talked about South America earlier. Plotting against Israeli interest in Venezuela, not outside the realm of possibility. Can't say they are, not saying that they are, but we mentioned, number one, that Iran is trying to establish more of a foothold in South America. Venezuela is one way they're trying to do it, according to Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz, and just the track record. Hey, Iran and Venezuela, under these past two administrations, Maduro now and Hugo Chavez prior, have had a very close and warm relationship. So we have that. Then we have the track record, not only of Hezbollah and Iranian activity in the tri-border region and where Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina meet. We discussed that earlier. If you missed any of this newscast, by the way, you can check out the full newscast when we're done. It'll be up on the YouTube channel. But dating back as well to 1992, 94, those deadly Iranian engineered attacks on Israeli and Jewish interest in Argentina. So could they use Venezuela as a staging ground? That is not outside the realm of possibility. Hey, we're going to run real quick mention again. Remember, canopy.us, canopy.us/Watchman. Excellent internet filter. You got kids, you got grandkids. You want to block this explicit, nasty content that all too often is at their fingertips online, on their phones, on their tablets. Canopy is a very good answer, folks, and it's an Israeli-made product, Israeli innovation, 15% Watchman discount. Hey, everyone's shopping now. This is a good gift. Say for your daughter or your sister, your aunt. This is a good gift, and it's all about, hey, keeping our kids, letting them be kids and not being, corrupted by the stuff that we're bombarded with today, the horrible influences that all too often we see online. So canopy.us/Watchman. Check it out. Very, very good product, Israeli innovation. Thanks so much for joining us here today on the Watchman Newscast live stream. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone until Friday. God bless you. Thanks for joining us. And remember, never hold your peace. See you soon. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.